April 7th is World Health Day. We decided that as the industry is looking to expand here domestically and increase their footprint in the US, not only for the wood pellet export market, but also for domestic forms of bioenergy. And so we really wanted to do an event on World Health Day that focused on the direct impacts to the communities that are living right next to these facilities on their health and on their local economies and their local forest resources and ecosystems.
Welcome, Wild Ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root podcast, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. It is the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance. For this episode, we're experimenting with two guests. Let's see if I can handle this. So for this episode, we have both Adam Colette and Alex Budd. Adam Colette is a senior nonprofit leader with 15 plus years of experience in program and campaign development. Adam's work has led to policy and community impact spanning from local government to international arenas. For the past 10 years, he's worked to challenge the growth of the global biomass industry as the programs director for Dogwood Alliance. And Alex Budd lives in Oregon, is the alliance organizer for the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance, and has been involved in climate justice and forest defense organizing for the last 15 years. Welcome to you both coming on the Green Root podcast.
Thanks, Josh.
Great to be here.
Yeah, well, biomass is a topic that has been near and dear to my heart, so to speak, in a really perverse way, I guess, for many years. Not a fan of biomass, extremely important. And you can't really talk about forest protection these days without dealing with the threat from so-called biomass energy. So let's just start from what is this big event that's planned on April 7th and how can people engage with that?
Yeah, so this is Adam. Biomass has been continually expanding. Biomass as a form of renewable energy has been continually expanding across the globe for a couple decades now. And here in the U.S., we've continued to see an expansion of these really dirty wood pellet biomass facilities, which are bad for our forests, our climate, and our communities, and really from the U.S. South and now on the West Coast to where Alex is located. And so one of the primary impacts that we're seeing, in addition to the increased clear cutting, in addition to all of the carbon pollution that's being pumped up into the atmosphere, is the health and the community related impacts of what's happening on the ground. To communities in the U.S. South, and now with companies like Drax trying to expand on the West Coast, the potential of that happening out there as well. And so we really wanted, April 7th is World Health Day. And so we decided that as the industry is looking to expand here domestically and increase their footprint in the US, not only for the wood pellet export market, but also for domestic forms of bioenergy, whether that's powering airplanes or AI data centers. They want to burn trees for anything. And so we really wanted to do an event on World Health Day that focused on the direct impacts to the communities that are living right next to these facilities on their health and on their local economies and their local forest resources and ecosystems. And so we joined together. I think the core of this event is communities from the West Coast and the U.S. South joining together in a national call to action. So the webinar is called Break Big Biomass, a national call to action. We're going to have issue experts and community representatives. The focus of the event is on public health. It is World Health Day, and it's on the public health impacts of the dirty biomass industry. And so the conversation will focus on those aspects of it. And I know we're just a couple weeks away from the event right now, but we already have nearly 500 people registered for the webinar. So it's going to be a great event. People are going to get an opportunity to have a variety of ways of taking action on the issue. We have state-specific actions, national actions that people can take. So if you're looking to learn more about the human impacts of the biomass industry, what it's doing from the very real story-based stuff to the very technical health studies. We're going to have health experts on the call as well. This is the webinar for you, as well as resources for you to get involved, let your legislator know, let your representative know, get involved in your local community, maybe find an organization in your state who's really working on this issue directly. This is going to be the webinar for you, and we definitely invite everybody to join the webinar. Again, it's April 7th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific time, and it'll run about an hour and a half.
I think that's beautiful. Definitely encourage people to be a part of it. I'm going to make it onto that. And for folks who are aware of my background, I had worked on biomass issues for so many years through the National Anti-Biomass Campaign for Energy Justice Network. And I ran a publication called the Biomass Monitor. And yeah, we always break down the issue in a few different ways. Of course, there's forest impacts, and this ties directly into all sorts of logging, but particularly the quote, fuel reduction or wildfire pretense logging in the West and other logging and clear cutting. There's the climate impacts from the CO2 going up the smokestack and removing from the forest, but there's also the public health impacts. And I think in many ways that can be the most compelling because human beings mostly care more about human beings, right, than ecology. It's just a natural thing. So it makes perfect sense to engage in that way. And particularly the environmental justice communities, however people frame it, lots of doctors, that's a lot of the focus that has been on it. A particulate matter can go into all the details of it, but it's for real. It is a supposed renewable energy source, which many of us don't consider truly renewable. And it has a lot of health impacts similar to other combustion-based energy. So that's great. Really psyched about that, and really psyched that you're putting out that out to the world. Cool. Well, let's get another take on things. So, Alex, do you want to just talk about some of the stuff that you're engaged in the Pacific Northwest and the West with biomass energy in general?
Yeah. So on one level, biomass is not new in the West. Most of the logging and wood processing mills in our region, which there's a long history of the timber industry here, use and have used biomass for power generation on their mill sites. Those are much smaller in scale than what we're talking about now, but that is nothing new. What is new is that there's been 4 proposed huge export terminals. So these would be facilities where trees are ground up and turned into wood pellets, and then loaded onto ships and exported across the Pacific to be burned in coal plants in East Asia. There's 2 proposed in Washington and 2 proposed in California. We're looking at like 1 million tons of pellets every year from each of these facilities. So really big volume. And in that sense, it's a very similar thing that many of our communities out here have been dealing with to the push over the last 20 years for fossil fuel exports up and down the West Coast with oil, gas, and coal terminals that were proposed along the Columbia River and the Salish Sea and the Oregon coast over the last 20 years. And that was a big push by the fossil fuel industry that was extracting coal, oil, and gas, mostly in the Intermountain West, in Western Colorado, in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming and Montana, and also interior British Columbia and Alberta to get new access to export those fossil fuels. And local community resistance managed to stop pretty much all of those proposals in the US. There were more in British Columbia on that side of the border that have gone forward, despite really inspiring opposition up there. So this new push, I think a lot of folks on the ground here in the Pacific Northwest see this new push for biomass export terminals in the same light. This is another attempt by big multinational corporate energy giants that are already burning the planet to use our communities. And again, like Adam said, and there's a long history with the biomass industry of setting up these facilities in marginalized, historically disadvantaged communities that are already dealing with poor air quality and the direct health impacts of that. So the main player right now out west here is a company called Drax, which is a company based out of the UK. They were originally a coal company before transitioning to be a biomass company, which is really telling, I think, of the way that these attempts to label biomass and burning trees for energy as renewable it's not renewable. We can go into the history of how it got that designation if you want, but So they're trying to build one facility in Washington and two in California. And as you alluded to, I think part of the push with that is a recognition that with climate exacerbated fires becoming more intense and severe throughout the West, there's a big push by political leaders to be seen to be doing something, and fuels reduction and thinning forests is the easy and obvious so-called solution for that. It doesn't actually protect communities or keep them safer. But the theory with the biomass companies is, oh, there's all this federal and state money that's going to be going into thinning forests that'll create a bunch of wood that won't be, you know, big, large trees necessarily. And we need something to do with it so the biomass industry can take that, turn it into pellets and ship it to be burned in coal plants. Now, we know from what we've learned from our friends like Adam and Dogwood and others in the Southeast that despite the biomass industry's claims that they're only using waste wood, sawdust, and wood chips and whatnot, that actually it's just much more economical for them to be taking whole trees and clear cutting forests to turn into wood pellets, because the energy density of the heartwood of trees is just so much more than bark and sawdust. So we know that that's where they're headed. Despite their attempts to frame this as we're just taking the waste and the stuff that no one else wants. The record is pretty clear that that's not actually what happens. So these four proposals right now are we're all in the waiting stage. There's one in Washington outside of Aberdeen that is currently in court. Earth Justice has sued over the permits for that one. The one in Longview along the Columbia River, we're waiting for the Clean Air Agency in Washington to reissue the permit. They issued it once about a year ago and then almost immediately withdrew it because there wasn't enough information from the company and they had doubts about it. And then the two in California that are proposed by Drax just had their draft environmental impact review period and comment period. So waiting to see what comes from that after a big push to turn out public comments and engagement. So we're in a waiting game and doing what we can to raise awareness. But yeah, it's been really helpful to connect with folks in the Southeast where this industry has been set up and much more established for a long time to learn about the direct, health impacts and how awful it is to have one of these things set up in your community.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that overview. I have been most familiar with the domestic use, and we were fighting facilities and tracking them, and of course, engaging with and quite aware of the exports to UK. And we were saying for a long time, pay attention to the West Coast. They're going to start doing it to, well, I mean, in this case, it's UK, but also Asia, elsewhere. And so now it's this bi-coastal basically exporting of our forests. And that's quite upsetting. And I think you're right to label this as a new push. There was this lull. I don't remember the exact dates. I want to say 2015-ish, something around there. There was a real dip in the push. And of course, a lot of us, and I think we can rightly claim, we beat them back. We made it clear that this is not cool. It's not renewable. We get to claim some credit for that, but also I think it had a lot to do with the spike of fracking and how natural gas was a lot cheaper, because this is an expensive energy source, because it's a stupid way to get energy is what it comes down to. But yeah, I think this new push is quite alarming. I haven't been able to engage as much in it directly other than dealing with what's going on with the wildfire pretense logging, how some of that might tie into it. So really glad to have you both who are up to speed with this to let our listeners know, and frankly, to inform me of the latest details. But let me ask you this question though. Tell me what, I'd like to get both of your takes on this. So it's chicken or the egg. Is it, if you build it, they will come, as in fight the facility? And I've been a part of both of this stuff, so I don't have a preference, but you fight the facility because once they have a facility, it's going to keep finding more, quote, feedstocks and cut down trees, and they'll use any justification? Or do you fight what's going on in the landscape, because then they won't have as easy access to materials and won't be able to say, we have all this materials, we don't know what to do with it, we can't. So chicken or the egg, which is the most important one to focus on?
I can try to answer that. I think I'll answer that a little bit with first a little context in that I think you mentioned a little bit about a lull in the industry, and I definitely agree with that. I mean, it is a completely stupid, uneconomical way to create energy, especially electricity, which is what they're primarily doing. Um, and that's always been the case. I mean, the whole globe is littered with failed biomass, millions and billions of dollars of wasted money that was most of it or a lot of it meant to actually do something to address climate change, or was renewable energy subsidies that just funneled into this industry. I think also too, and this is building up to actually answering your question, but I think also too, we are in for the past, I would say 6 months to a year, on the international level, there have been a numerous amount of policy victories against the biomass industry. We're seeing, we saw just the other day a major facility in the Netherlands, which had been on the table for years, we'd been fighting for years, was finally pulled the plug on it. Germany had a victory on its biomass subsidies. We've seen lots of really positive progression in Japan and Korea, although they are still pumping billions of dollars of subsidies into bioenergy. We're seeing positive direction there on future subsidies for biomass. So that international wood pellet market there's signs that it's really drying up, and kind of the heyday of, the 20 teens that it really had. Nonetheless, they're still trying to expand and build the facilities. We know that, like, as they build these facilities, which is why I suspect that a company like Drax is really trying to rush and build these facilities on the West Coast, establish that. And just one quick correction there, Josh and Alex, you can correct me on this, but I believe that's part of Drax's wood pellet business. Those pellets will actually go to Asia. They will go to feed the Asian market, not be shipped around to the UK. So I think in the moment that we're in right now, I would argue that in this time and space, it makes a lot of sense to fight the facilities, because I think that, like, the longer we can delay and challenge and stop the build out of these facilities, they're only going to become more uneconomical, right? Like, they're only going to become more uneconomical. They're only going to get delayed, and I think that the global policy landscape is shifting away from large scale wood pellet export markets. Now, we also know that the domestic biomass market here in the US, the industry has big dreams of expansion here. And I think that's also a big threat, whether it's sustainable aviation fuel, whether it's BECCS, which is bioenergy carbon capture and storage, where they burn the biomass and then they supposedly pump the carbon underground, which is completely, pretzel logic. It's completely ridiculous. That's still a threat. But I would argue that protect the facilities. And then the one last thing I'd say about actually a landscape approach is, I think longer term, bigger picture, that's where we actually need to go. We can't just continue to fight facilities individually, one off. That we have to turn that defense into offense at some point, because the way I often look about this, having worked on this for a while, is, I mean, you take biomass. Okay, here's the basic concept. We're going to clear cut forests in North America, or in Brazil, or in Canada, or in Malaysia, and we're going to truck them to a facility. We're going to put them through this heavy energy intensive process to grind up those pellets. And then we're going to, put a bunch of chemicals in. We're going to create pellets. Then we're going to put them on a truck or a train. We're going to ship them to a port. We're going to put them on a big ship. We're going to ship them across an ocean. We're going to put them on another train. And then we're going to take that train. We're going to take it to a power plant, throw it up a big conveyor belt, and throw it into an incinerator. And that is our, like, solution to the climate crisis, right? Like, that's renewable energy. You explain that to a 5-year-old, and they're like, that is stupid. Like, that makes no sense. Like, so how is it the case that, I think in some cases, well-intentioned people, across the globe are saying, oh, let's do this, right? Let's give hundreds of millions of dollars to this. Like, I don't think everybody that's making decisions on a policy level around the globe is just like completely illiterate, can't, like corporate tycoon who's like trying to just find any way to burn money. Like I think that they're generally smart people. So how is it the case? And I think the case is because we have years and years of essentially hiding the impacts of industrial logging. We hide the impacts. We don't acknowledge them in any sort of reporting or policy. The example that I love to give to people is here in the US South, we're a majority of private land. If you clear cut 100 acres in my home state of North Carolina, clear cut it, just completely take everything away from the landscape, and you just leave it. On paper, that's still considered a forest. We still count that as forest land. So when you hear a statistic like 200 million acres of forests are out there and growing, they're considering the hundreds of thousands of forested acres that had just been clear cut the previous year and are basically nil in terms of biodiversity and climate benefit. And so that's just one example. And so I say that because until we address the fundamental accounting and ways that we only value forests for when they're logged and not when they're standing, until we start to address those fundamental disconnects around how we treat the forested landscape within policy and the role of forests as a solution to climate change, whether or not we stop these Drax facilities in the US South or in the West Coast, some other stupid, god-awful industry is going to come up with a way to use forests because it's on paper, it'll make sense to people. The economics, they'll be able to come up with some new way to log forests and make it make sense from a climate or economic development perspective. And so we have to begin to acknowledge the impacts of logging. And until we can actually acknowledge the impacts of logging, can we truly assess what is the cost of wood products, and biomass being one of those. And so cost to the climate and cost to communities and what have you. And so, I say all of that because at a certain point we do have to go on a landscape level. We do have to go and really fight for forest protection, fight to acknowledge those impacts, fight to change the narrative that industrial logging is good for communities and is good for the climate, and in many cases has convinced people that logging is good for forests, which is just, completely crazy. But like that, saying that is crazy, but it actually is true. When you talk to folks, they're saying like, we got to log the forest to keep the forest, whatever. Yeah, I mean, that's like some sort of, and it's solely based on economic modeling and extraction economies, not actually what's good for forests, what's good for a climate.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. So would you say an accurate thing would be short-term facility focus, long-term landscape? Of course, we have to do both, but.
Yeah, you got to do both. And I would say long-term is not like 20 years. Long-term is like within the next like couple. Like, let's fight these facilities right now, but like, let's also, let's get on that movement building piece as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I felt a little guilty because I haven't been working on facilities as of recently. Most of my focus was in the past. I was very happy to see this facility up here in Colorado, the only larger biomass facility that called the Eagle Valley. I have to put finger quotes for every word, but Eagle Valley Clean Energy Center, and it actually shut down, not because we were able to shut it down, but because it was just economically unfeasible. So yeah, so I'm really glad that you all are on top of the facility stuff and letting people know about it. I need to find ways to engage more in that personally. But talking about West Coast there, Alex, what would you say in regards to facility landscape? Do you have a similar view as Adam's view?
Yeah, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's like a yes and. It's a both of those things. I mean, I think the facility fight reminds me a lot of the fossil fuel export fights that we had here, where that's just very natural. They're such capital intensive things to build and pieces of the production chain that they're naturally bottlenecks. And right now, there's none of these big pellet production facilities in the area around here. And so if we can stop those from being built, then it keeps the industry out. So that I think again is like a very effective short-term way of preventing them from getting a foothold. And I think as you alluded to, once these things are built, because they are, so expensive and require so much capital and money to put into them, there's a really strong incentive for those owners to keep them running. And we saw that with, the fossil fuel terminals too, of we need to stop this, fracked gas LNG plant from getting built, because once it's built, the people who own it are going to try and get as much money out of it as they can. And getting something like that to shut down after it's been constructed is much harder than preventing it from being built in the first place. At the same time, just like Adam said, I think we also need, much more broader and more systemic changes to how we understand and relate to forests, how we use them, how we view them, and the values that we consider legible that forests provide. I think there's another driver too, which I think Adam you both have kind of alluded to, which is the climate side of things and subsidies. So, I mean, the biomass industry has been getting billions of dollars in subsidies. I mean, Drax alone has, for many years, gotten almost $1 million a day in subsidies from the UK government alone, and other governments in the European Union have also been subsidizing this industry, because that's how they've kind of bet on that, as like, this is how we can reach our climate targets. And again, that comes down to this accounting error that was made in the 90s during the kind of run up in the Kyoto Protocol era. At that point, there was, I think, again, like Adam mentioned, it's not, nefarious tycoons cackling in back rooms. I think there's a lot of like well-intentioned people. And at that point, there just wasn't as good of data about carbon cycles and forests. And there was a wariness of, we don't want to be double counting carbon emissions from both the logging of forests and the burning of wood pellets. So we're just not going to count. We're only going to count, we won't count the burning side or the logging side. There's better data now. So, that was a very rough kind of like, we'll just call it a wash kind of calculation. And that is what allowed biomass to be classified as renewable energy. And that's what incentivized the states trying to meet climate goals, and states in the sense of like the European Union and states in East Asia to pour so much money and subsidies into this, because that's how it was an easier way. Again, a lot of this comes down to like, what's easy for people with money. It's much easier to label burning trees as clean energy and put money into that. And in East Asia, part of the drive here is that you can burn wood pellets in a coal plant. We don't need to build new power production infrastructure in the way that if you're trying to build out solar and wind and geothermal and other things, that requires putting more capital into building new facilities to produce that power. And with wood pellets, you can burn them in a coal plant. You can burn them with coal, even in cogenerate. And so it's just simpler for the people that have money and that have these sunk assets in fossil fuel infrastructure that prevents them from needing to convert it. So I think that's a big driver as well. And so I think that's another angle on the same kind of like upstream side of things, as like, how can we change land use rules and regulations to prevent, and that will kind of cut off some of the drive for this industry. I think cutting back the subsidies and the classification of biomass as renewable energy is another kind of upstream pressure point or point of intervention. And there's been some success on that. Drax got much smaller subsidies relatively when they were just renewed this year. So they're still getting millions of dollars, but they're not getting as much as they were. And I believe there are also some subsidy reductions in the other parts of the EU as well, though Adam might know more about that.
Cool. Yeah.
Sorry, I forget. I kind of went on a tangent there. I'm forgetting what your actual original question was.
No.
About the way.
No, you answered that. Basically, I was saying landscape, this facility. I mean, it's a trick question. Obviously, we have to do both, but maybe focusing on one thing while it's happening. I think you both answered that really well. And you brought up, of course, the elephant in the room, the subsidies. It's just, if people keep throwing money at a thing, free money, they're going to take it. And that's also what's happening with wildfire pretense logging. If you follow it, they're just billions of dollars here, cut down these forests. So they're going to keep doing that. And more of us are realizing it's like, okay, we can fight each of these individual timber sales, or we can go to the root and see where they're getting all this funding from. And we're actually trying to address that in the state level here in Colorado. We're cutting off the funding source because the state is funding a lot of stuff going on here. Of course, it's routed through federal, state, it's way too complicated. But no, that was a great answer.
I think that in general, I am not, there is, Alex is probably going to know, and maybe even yourself, a lot more about the specifics and be more educated to talk about the wildfire debate. But I think that it's important to note that, what do I want to say here? I feel like I want to say, like, we are seeing, and particularly under the current administration, we are seeing the logging and biomass industries. I mean, they're one and the same, but the logging industry, with biomass being a primary market that they want to feed to, use the very real world impacts of fires that are happening out west, which are devastating to so many communities and so many people. But use that as kind of political headwinds, to just completely gut and undercut protections for forests, public input for logging on our national forests, and just completely use it as this highway to drive huge new, you know, expansion of logging across our country. And it's incredibly dangerous. It's going to make the fire situation worse in the long run. Um, and we need to be talking about this more. We need to be listening to forest defenders and activists who are very educated on this issue, more and more, because it's very easy to be misinformed about this. I think biomass issues, one of the hallmarks has been, it's the industry has always relied on people not knowing enough, and it's not like you have to be so educated on it, but I think the same issue is happening with fires. They're using these talking points that sound good in theory, but it is not good for forests. And any increase in logging in this time of a climate emergency, is bad. So I just want to make that point that, like, we really, really need to be careful about the industry's use of fire as a vehicle for a massive expansion of logging across the country, and that's being pushed now. Even though it feels like it's a huge uphill battle right now, I'll just say, as a hope for people, just because they say they're going to do it doesn't mean that they're doing it tomorrow. It takes these companies and industries a long time to set up. It takes them a long time. They can't just flip a switch and all of a sudden, like, a massive new expansion. They need to find markets. They need to. So the time is now for us to continue to talk about this, for people to start to organize, for the forest protection movement in general to unite again across the country. I really believe that we need to more deeply incorporate nature and forests into our climate narratives. I'm all about stopping fossil fuels every damn day of the year. I also believe, and just to say it, we have gotten a little too deep in the, like, fossil fuels are bad, renewables are good branding for the climate movement, and we've a little bit forgotten about nature. And that's my opinion. And again, it's not that, like, we shouldn't be going after fossil fuels, but it's like, of course we need to. But, like, we also need to remember protection of nature is so critical right now. And I think it's time, and the moment is ripe to really, to bring that back, because of the current administration's recent attacks on forests, because of the industry's use of fire to try to enact a massive expansion of logging. And so, you know, biomass is an enormous issue. Again, we're doing this webinar on April 7th. And it is high time that we reignite a massive forest protection movement across this country to protect what we have left.
Yeah, 100%. And my listeners probably are sick of me talking about wildfire, honestly. So they're probably happy to hear somebody else saying these things that I say constantly. But yeah, no, you're completely right. I agree with you completely on pretty much everything you just said there. The way I look at it is more ecosystem advocacy, and definitely climate stuff, definitely fossil fuel stuff. But yeah, we've kind of gone away as a movement from as you say, nature-based, but yeah, I call it ecosystem advocacy. And we're up against these greenwash narratives, wildfire hysteria, the concept of biogenic carbon, which is basically if it comes out of a tree, it's magic fairy dust carbon, it doesn't count, like all this insane stuff, which actually gives me the opportunity to pitch my novel again, my horror novel that's literally about biomass logging and burning. And it's an eco folk horror novel. My listeners hopefully have already read my book. If not, it's called Charwood, and you can pick it up online from Agata Triad, the publisher. So yeah, I get into all that stuff and how easy it is to bamboozle people around these ideas. First, basically this is an activist. And the reason I bring this up is not just to pitch my novel. Also, it is to do that, but just how easy it is to get people tricked. So basically in this, she hears, oh, these people are these climate activists. And she's like, I want to be a part of that. I care about the climate. We do renewable energy. What kind? Oh, well, we burn forests. And she's like, huh, well, I guess they know better. And then you find out it's this cult and it's actually, there's demons and stuff. So it goes a bit far afield, but it ties directly into all of that silliness around this story that they're telling us. But guess what? The industry agency story has been quite compelling. So I do think it is up to us to tell a better story. And I think that's what many of us and you folks are doing. But I do want to inject some controversy, some fake controversy into this. So what I want to say, almost like an East Coast versus West Coast rap battle here. So which is more at threat from the biomass industry, the West or the East?
Established on the East Coast and the impact. I mean, where it still is like we're trying to stop it from getting established here. So, I mean, I think, yeah, folks in the Southeast have been dealing with the impacts that over here are still largely theoretical.
Would you? So
I'll let Alex speak for me. Here's what I'll say though. This is a friendly rap battle here. I would say though that the West Coast is much more likely for an expansion of domestic markets, so biomass to be burned here. Here in the South, our political climates are different, and we still, we're not going to have state level environmental or climate action policies that really have the potential to drive biomass. And we certainly have our share of wildfires, and it's been kind of a bad season in the South for us, but it's nowhere on the scale of the kind of wildfire hysteria and both real world impacts, but then also industry narratives that we just talked about out West. And so I think, yes, in terms of the biomass wood pellet market, the South is the world's leading exporter. And, we are the epicenter of that export market. Domestically, though, I think the West is probably a bigger threat for an expansion of the industry just because of its history there, the state level climate policies that could drive more incentives and subsidies combined with the wildfire narrative and threat.
That's great. Well, yeah, so you did a nice guy rap battle where you advocated for one another's side, which is great because that's what we need to do, right? We need to not just be like, it only matters in my backyard. This is a national, and in fact, it's an international issue. And so I think it's great that you both are acknowledging that and engaging on that. Of course, where we're at, we have to focus on areas where we live. So I'm here in Colorado. A lot of my focus is on Colorado, but certainly not all. I'm tying it into the whole West. And then we also have to realize that this wildfire pretense logging narrative is also happening in the East. It's very interesting how now you can go up into Vermont and they're like, well, wildfire fuel reduction. You're like, you kidding me? Like they didn't really try to do that 10, 15 years ago, but that's why I think it's so important to push back against that aspect in the West, because they're going to try to replicate that everywhere. This is the proving grounds. And if they can pull it off here, they're just going to do it anywhere, even in like the wettest ecosystems. And in fact, I mean, Pacific Northwest is literally some of the wettest ecosystems, and they're advocating for that. But Alex, did you have anything more to add to the rap battle?
I mean, I think it's, yeah, I guess kind of continuing on that theme of like, yes, and I think finding ways to connect these different fights is really helpful. And I mean, for us, when we learned about these proposals, being able to go to Adam and other folks at Dogwood and say, what's this biomass industry all about? And being able to learn so much so quickly, including like here's what we found to be successful, like fighting it at the local level, stopping them from getting the permits rather than trying to shut them down or focusing on the state level. Like that kind of information is really helpful in sharpening our learning curve out here to make us more effective. And I think also being able to highlight the stories of the folks who are already living with these facilities has been really, really powerful in building opposition at the local community level here. Hearing the stories of folks in places like Gloucester that live next to these facilities and what the impacts have been like. And I think that's, I mean, I was very involved for a number of years here in the fight to stop the Jordan Cove frack gas export plant on the Oregon coast. And we did a project where we took some of the folks that were very involved in that fight from Oregon out to Western Colorado to meet with folks who were trying to stop fracking out there, the expansion of fracking, and then bringing some of those folks who were involved in that fight to stop the expansion of fracking in Southwest Colorado out to Oregon. And then did a series of events to kind of introduce and try and connect these like upstream, downstream fights, especially I think with like point source facility fights and campaigns. It's really easy for it to just get hyper local. And there's so many of those things, and capital has, so many tentacles and so much money that's always going to be a David and Goliath fight. And so how do we stitch and weave those different local fights together into a bigger picture so that people have this sense of we're part of a larger movement and we're all fighting kind of the same beast from different angles, I think is really important. And that's what it's going to take to, do more than just shut down these individuals' facilities, but to actually make that larger systemic transformative change when whether that's, the economic system and capitalism or how we relate and interact with the natural world and forests and ecologies as human society.
Well, that's a beautiful summation. Yeah, we're all about addressing the root causes on the Green Root podcast, which is kind of the name. So I'll definitely include the link to the April 7th event in the description. But do either of you have any last words for the audience on the issue or where they can find your stuff? I definitely want to hear that.
Yeah, well, I just thank you, Josh, and the Green Root podcast and your listeners for tuning in, for learning and educating themselves about these important issues, and for taking the time to talk about this. Of course, you can find our work at dogwoodalliance.org or on several of the social media channels. I would encourage folks to go there and check it out. And then, of course, really, I think the best way is to join that April 7th webinar, and there'll be links and action packet to depending on where you're at, be able to get involved on a more local level. So, but yeah, check it out at dogwoodalliance.org.
Cool. Thank you, Adam. And Alex?
Yeah, the Forest Climate Alliance, you can find out more at forestclimatealliance.org and get connected to us from there. We're not as active on social media, but we do have an Instagram and a Twitter. But yeah, check out the website, get involved from there, and definitely sign up and join the webinar on April 7th and get involved and be part of the fight.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for coming on the podcast. And, more importantly, thanks for all the great work that you both are doing. It's super important. And yeah, I think it's one of the most difficult but crucial fights because unlike a lot of other issues, we kind of have to start from the ground up to explain. You don't have to explain to most people climate change, right? They either care or they don't. But for some of this stuff, it's almost like we have to go back to basics and say, okay, so here's what they're doing. Here's why it's bad. So it's a bit of a challenge, but hopefully like I am, you're just extra engaged and you like that challenge. And that's what I would guess for you to take on such a hard topic. So thank you for both of you for doing this. Really appreciate it.